Hi. As we've been going through the books of Samuel, we've seen the rise and fall of King Saul and then the rise of King David through a time of success and blessing, uniting and establishing the kingdom of Israel. But then, as we heard last week, David sinned horribly. His adultery with Bathsheba and his conspiring to murder her husband Uriah were catastrophic. When he was confronted by the prophet Nathan, David humbled himself and repented. "I've sinned against the Lord." And Nathan replied, "The Lord has taken away your sin." We recall Hannah's song at the beginning of the book of Samuel and the three phrases which have formed the theme for this series of sermons. God opposes the proud and exalts the humble. Despite human evil, God is at work to fulfill his purposes, and God will raise up a messianic king. In particular, today, in chapters 13 to 18, we see the second of these coming into play. Despite human evil, God is at work to fulfill his purposes. God hasn't finished with David yet, but terrible times lie ahead. God may have forgiven David, but he still has to live with the consequences of his sin. And the prophet Nathan speaks a word of judgment to David. "Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you." In spite of David's fervent prayers for the son Bathsheba had borne to him, the child died. And we read that David comforted Bathsheba, and later she gave birth to another son, Solomon, who would be the one to continue God's plan. But more calamity was about to come through David's other children. Amnon, David's son, lusted after his half-sister Tamar, who was David's daughter and the sister of Absalom. He contrived to get her into his bedroom, and when she refused his advances, he raped her and then sent her away. She was ruined and went to live with her in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. David was furious when he heard what Amnon had done, but he took no action, and Amnon went unpunished. David was abdicating his responsibility here, both as a king and as a father. Had he acted decisively, everything that was to come may never have happened. However, Absalom hated his brother Amnon for violating his sister, and he bided his time. Absalom waited and plotted, and 2 years later he held a feast for all his brothers, including Amnon. And during the feast, Absalom's men under orders killed Amnon. Then, fearing David's anger because he'd murdered his brother, Absalom fled. He stayed in a neighbouring kingdom for 3 years, but David mourned and longed for him. After 3 years, Joab, David's army commander, persuaded him to allow Absalom to return to Jerusalem. But David insisted that he had to live in his own house and was not allowed to see or meet David face to face. Eugene Peterson has written a book about David called "Leap Over a Wall," and in it, which is a quote from Psalm 18, verse 29, "By my God, I can leap over a wall." And in his book, Peterson writes, David's pardon of Absalom was impersonal. His forgiveness was a judicial act, not a fatherly embrace. As a result, what Abraham experienced and felt was total rejection by his father. We can't help comparing this with the story which Jesus told of the prodigal son and the father who was constantly looking for his return, and who, when he finally came back, ran to meet him, embraced him, and rejoiced in their reconciliation. David himself had received forgiveness from God, but was unwilling to show the same grace and mercy to Absalom. Eugene Peterson suggests that this lack of forgiveness was a third great sin of David, in addition to his adultery and murder. We're not told if Absalom actually ever asked for forgiveness for what he had done. And so Absalom lived for 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing David. Then Absalom called Joab, saying, "Why have I come back to Jerusalem? I might as well have stayed where I was. I want to see the king's face, and if I am guilty of anything, let him put me to death." "If I am guilty" suggests that Absalom wasn't really feeling any remorse or guilt for what he had done. So David relented and summoned Absalom, who bowed down before him, and David finally kissed his son. But it was too late. The damage was done. As time went by, Absalom began to make himself known among the people of Israel. He equipped himself with a chariot and horses and gathered a small army of men. He set himself up in a place in Jerusalem where anyone who came to King David for justice would meet Absalom first and be charmed by him. He was playing a long game of undermining his father. He was plotting to take the kingdom from David by force. Absalom built up a following among the people. And we read in chapter 15, verse 6, "And so he stole the hearts of the men of Israel." After 4 years of sowing seeds of dissension against King David, and confident that he had the people on his side, Absalom made his move. He went to David and asked permission to go to Hebron to fulfill a vow. Once he was there, he sent out messengers to all the tribes of Israel to proclaim, "Absalom is king in Israel. He's king in Hebron." Absalom had staged a coup against his father. And as his conspiracy gained strength, his following kept on increasing. It was outright civil war, son against father. When messengers came saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom," David, rather than fight his own son, fled from Jerusalem with all his household, his officials and his loyal followers. The priests and the Levites took with them the Ark of the Covenant, but after making a sacrifice to the Lord, David ordered them to take the Ark back to Jerusalem. He said, "If I find favour in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if he says, 'I am not pleased with you,' then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." So David continued out of Jerusalem and up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. Everyone around him was weeping. Then the news came to David that his closest advisor and friend, Ahithophel, had deserted him and gone over to Absalom. This was yet another devastating blow and betrayal for David. David prayed, "O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." Now David had planted a spy, Hushai, in Absalom's court, and Hushai countered the advice Ahithophel gave to Absalom and also sent information about Absalom's plans back to David. So David was forced out into the wilderness, a fugitive again, hunted by his own son, just as he had many years before been hunted by King Saul. And it's as though there, in that wilderness place, in that dire situation, that David rediscovered himself. He remembered who he was. He became decisive and prepared for battle. Hushai described David to Absalom in one of their councils. You know your father and his men, they are fighters, and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Your father is an experienced fighter, and those with him are brave. Knowing that Absalom's army was advancing towards him, David organised his forces, dividing them into 3 sections. He tells them that he will be going out to fight with them, but his men argue against him joining them. You must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care, but you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better now for you to give us support from the city. David was no longer the youthful warrior that he had been, and he's growing old. And he now shows real humility as he replies, I will do whatever seems best to you. The commanders of the 3 divisions of David's army were Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. And as they prepared to march out, David instructed them, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. He's also recovering his compassion and perhaps belatedly showing his love for his son. His clear orders were that Absalom should not be killed. And so David's forces marched out against Absalom and the armies of Israel. And many people died that day as the battle spread through the countryside and the surrounding forest. As Absalom was riding through the forest, the long, luxurious hair, of which he was immensely proud, became entangled in an overhanging branch. The mule that he was riding kept going, and Absalom was left hanging helplessly from the tree. One of Joab's men saw him and ran to report it to Joab. I've just seen Absalom hanging from an oak tree. What? Said Joab. You saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground then and there? Joab immediately took some men and went to where Absalom still hung alive in the tree. And ignoring David's orders, he plunged 3 javelins into Absalom, and his men hacked him to death. Joab then had trumpets sounded to call off the battle, and the Israelite rebels who had been following Absalom fled to their homes. Nathan's words from the Lord had come true. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. When David heard what had happened, he was shocked. Deeply moved and heartbroken, he went to his room and wept and mourned for his son. In spite of Absalom's betrayal and David's previous hard-hearted rejection of him, at the end it was David's love and his heartbreak over Absalom's death which defined David's true character. Eugene Peterson writes, loving Absalom that day was one of the most magnificent things David ever did. God's call to love one another and forgive one another, later exemplified in Jesus and throughout the New Testament, can be seen in David's grief and his heartbroken lament for his son. Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. We're told that David is a man after God's own heart. But what do we see when we look at David? And what does God see? He's a fighter, a shedder of blood. He's a musician, a poet, a man of prayer. He never performed any miracles. He's a man of honour, but he's also flawed. He's not perfect. He pretends to be mad. He eats bread from the holy altar. He's got a weakness for beautiful women, which leads him into adultery. And he's guilty of a despicable murder. He can't control his family. He's deeply human, just like us. But the thing that makes him a man after God's own heart is God. God is in his life and he is in God's life. His relationship with God is the golden thread running through David's life. And what we learn from David's life, more than any other Bible character apart from Jesus, is that to live this life, we have to deal with God. Eugene Peterson again writes, David's importance isn't in his morality or his military prowess, but in his experience of and witness to God. Every event in his life was a confrontation with God. So David's whole life is centered around God and God's will and purposes. When he sins, he knows he's sinned against God. God is the dominant, overriding influence in his life. But David is us too. John Calvin wrote, "Let us therefore remember that David is like a mirror in which God sets before us the continual course of his grace." We can see ourselves reflected in David's life and in his Psalms. We live in a different time and culture, but we're part of the same humanity. We have the same feelings, but we also have different feelings. We're all imperfect. We do good stuff and we do bad stuff. And we too have God in our lives, and God has us in his life. Our lives are in him. He has forgiven us and he loves us. He loves us just as we are, but he wants more and better for us and from us. Jesus came and died to win for us that intimacy with God the Father. Peterson writes, we can, of course, refuse to participate in God. We can act as if God weren't our designer, provider, and covenant presence. But when we refuse, we become less. Our essential humanity is less. Our lives are diminished and impoverished. Jesus came so that we might have life and have it to the fullest. Tom Wright says, if you want to know who God is, look at Jesus. If you want to know what it means to be human, look at Jesus. If you want to know what love is, look at Jesus. If you want to know what grief is, look at Jesus. And go on looking until you're not just a spectator, but you're actually part of the drama which has him as its central character. So how are we going to live? Like David, courageously, seeking God, praising, praying, repenting, forgiving, and loving, and looking constantly at Jesus. We've seen in the story of David and Absalom, God opposing the pride and arrogance of Absalom and exalting the humility of David. David is being lifted from the pit of sin into which he had fallen and restored to his place in God's plan. We've seen that despite human evil, God is still working out his purposes, and that his plan to raise up a messianic king from the line of David is still intact and will ultimately be fulfilled in Jesus. Amen.